All right, so there's a lot that's going on right now, and I wanted to make this video just to help to keep you informed. So today we're talking about something the President of the United States himself has actually branded. He's calling it the Donroe Doctrine, and it's a play on the 200-year-old Monroe Doctrine, the idea from 1823 that the United States gets to act as a sort of protector for the whole Western Hemisphere and keep outside powers out. It's not just a nickname floating around online in reality. It's written into actual United States national security strategy. And the language is that the United States will, reassert and enforce the Monroe Doctrine. This is in an effort to preserve American dominance in the hemisphere and deny what they describe as outside powers control of strategic locations and assets. And when we say when they say actually outside powers, in this case, they're kind of talking about China. All right, so that's the doctrine. Now let's talk about what it actually looks like in practice, because it's not subtle. On the 3rd of January this year, the United States launched something called Operation Absolute Resolve. Now, American forces bombed the Venezuelan infrastructure, breached the presidential compound, and took Nicolas Maduro and his wife into custody. 32 Cuban soldiers who were also stationed in Venezuela, they end up dying in that operation, or more effectively, they were unalived in that operation. Maduro was flown out to New York to face narco-terrorism charges that were actually filed back in 2020 under the same administration that just captured him. Now, interesting to note in this case is that there was no UN Security Council resolution involved, no extradition treaty signed, no international court came involved. And Trump's not exactly hiding what's coming next. Now, he told CNN, quote, "Cuba is gonna fall pretty soon, after 50 years," unquote. His Justice Department has apparently already formed a working group to build criminal charges against Cuban officials, run out of the same Florida U.S. Attorney's Office that's been prosecuting Biden-era political opponents. Now, meanwhile, the State Department, those are the guys who report to Marco Rubio, they're reportedly in talks, and they're calling, for what they're calling a friendly takeover of Cuba. And that's a friendly takeover of a separate country. Just let that sit for a second. Now, here's the part that connects it to everything else we talk about, because this isn't really just about Venezuela or Cuba individually. It's about China. Now, China's been spending a lot of money and a lot of time building relationships across Latin America and the Caribbean through what they call, their Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, something like $35 billion has been spent in renewable projects since 2010 alone, plus over, $1 billion or so to purchase a port in Peru. For their part, the United States have been actively working to roll back some of these advances made by China, and they leaned on Panama over Hong Kong-based companies' port operations that were tied to the Panama Canal. And they warned Peru directly that, in their words, cheap Chinese money can cost their sovereignty. That's a little bit more than a veiled threat. Now, even the Venezuela operation lines up with this. The United States Energy Secretary, this guy is a former fracking CEO, so big oil, big energy. He was in Caracas within weeks talking about getting American access to Venezuela's oil reserves. And this doesn't sound like it was a coincidence. So when you step back and connect the dots, this looks like a superpower competition, and it's been played out in small countries that were hungry for the development and the investment that was brought over by China. And now they're coming under pressure from the United States, who really don't want any outside forces, as their Donroe Doctrine states, to have too much of an influence in their Western Hemisphere. Now, this is where it gets close to home. Late February, Rubio actually flew to St. Kitts and Nevis for a CARICOM summit, sat down with all 15 member nations and told them, basically, that the region is better off with Maduro gone from Venezuela. Some leaders leaned in, like Trinidad's Prime Minister Kamla Persad Bissesa. Now, she already aligned the Trinidad government pretty openly with Washington's version of events, and she was all too happy to promote the regime change idea. Now, others tried to say nothing at all when asked directly if CARICOM was being pulled into the Cuban regime change. The bloc's chairman reportedly gave a non-answer, something of the sign, CARICOM has not involved itself in any discussion of such nature, blah, blah, blah. If you pay close attention to it, it's a very careful way of saying nothing. Now, for his part, Andrew Holness, Jamaica's Prime Minister, gave what you could probably consider the most honest response of anybody in the bunch. He warned that a prolonged crisis in Cuba, quote, will not remain confined to Cuba, unquote. It'll hit migration, security, and the economy across the whole Caribbean basin. He's correct about that. But notice, he's warning about the consequences and not naming who's causing them. And that's actually consistent with how Jamaica has been playing the whole thing. Former Prime Minister Bruce Golding came out hard, reportedly calling Trump a megalomaniac over the Venezuela operation. Holness, on the other hand, has been notably measured, not really condemning anything or anyone. Now, here's the thing that I think most people miss. This isn't a new dilemma for Jamaica. Now, it's the same fight that's been playing out since independence. Jamaica's two major political parties have historically split on exactly this. The JLP has leaned towards the US, going all the way back to founder Alexander Bustamante, who summed up his foreign policy in a few words: we are with the West. The PNP, for their part, built closer ties with Cuba and Venezuela over decades. That's the lineage that gave you the Petrocaribe deal with Hugo Chavez. And here's the twist. Even though the current JLP government leans pro-US historically, it's also continued deepening ties with China, something Washington has apparently not been thrilled about. Jamaica's actually sitting right in the crosshairs of exactly the competition we're just talking about, trying to keep good relations with the United States, which dominates its tourism, remittances, and immigration ties, while also not wanting to burn the bridge with China, which by some accounts has invested more in the country over the last 2 decades than the United States has. This isn't abstract for Jamaica. It's not some far-off Washington think tank memo. It's an actual live tension inside Jamaica foreign policy right now. And by the way, this all sits on top of a deeper irony. Back in 1972, Jamaica, along with, I think, Guyana, Barbados, and Trinidad, defied US pressure and formally recognized Cuba, a real assertion of independent Caribbean foreign policy in the middle of the Cold War of all things. Now, 50 years after this, the question is whether that kind of independent posture still exists, or whether, as one Caribbean commentator put it, sovereignty in this region is really just a privilege Washington extends at its pleasure. So, when I step back and look at all of the things that's happening, everything that's playing out, you have a superpower competition over ports, oil, and strategic assets, dressed up kind of in a language of law enforcement and sovereignty. And the country is actually caught in the middle, Jamaica, Trinidad, the rest of CARICOM. They really don't get a seat at the table where any of this gets decided. They get to pick which powerful friend they annoy the least. And that's not a good place to be in. In Jamaica, there's a saying that goes, cockroach doesn't business in foul fight. And it's kind of similar to that African proverb that says, when the elephants play, the grass gets trampled. Make of that what you will. I don't think that there's a clean villain and hero story here, to be honest. But I do think you have to ask yourself, when a US president names his own foreign policy after himself and calls it a doctrine, and a region that, has been struggling after independence, that in some instances they were given, in other cases they fought for, is left mostly reacting than deciding what will happen in the future, you have to ask yourself, who benefits if everybody keeps quiet? Is there any benefit to be gained from just letting things play out while, you keep your head down? The ostrich policy or the ostrich approach. I hear from folks talking about this all the time, and I just want to continue developing on it because I think it's an interesting topic and it's going to affect the lives of millions of people across the region and even those persons who live outside of the region who have interest and investment at home. But let me know what it looks like from where you're sitting. What do you think is going to happen? But that's all I have for now. We'll catch up on the next one.